Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. I understand we've got people from all over Queensland, from the Gold Coast, Chinchilla, Nambour, and even from 1,000 miles away up near Cairns. I do extend to you all a welcome. I notice also we've got a very big sprinkling of church leaders in the audience. I'm very pleased to see that. Now, my name's John Brett, and I've been asked to chair this meeting this evening. Why they've picked the worst public speaker in Australia to chair the meeting for one of the best public speakers in Australia, I will never know. However, I will do my best. It's possibly because I've known Jeremy longer than anybody else here, with the exception of Nancy. And I could make quite a long speech on Jeremy, but that's not the purpose tonight. I first met Jeremy when he had just arrived in this country. He came from Kenya, where he'd been involved in the Mau Mau terrorist campaign over there. He was drafted into the army and found his way into intelligence. And while he was in military intelligence, he discovered that what was going on in his country was being organised and paid for from without his country. And ultimately, that terror campaign was to succeed, to the bewilderment and amazement of the people of that country. And knowing what was to come, he left Kenya and came to Australia, as it looked like the safest place to be. But he wasn't here very long when he discovered the same things going on in this country that had happened in his own country. And it didn't take him long, knowing what he knew, to find that the same subversive elements, with the same sort of finance, was well and truly at work in Australia. So he had to make a decision whether he's going to continue running away from this, or he would have to stay. The only other place that offered any possibility of a refuge was New Zealand. But he decided, well, it looks like I'll have to stay and fight another battle. And when you look at the nature of the battle that has been going on in the 25 years since he's been in this country, when he first entered this battle, not a lot of us knew anything at all about it. He knew a lot about it and found it extremely difficult to convey to people that there was something wrong and there was worse to come. But he wasn't daunted. He decided to press on. His information was pretty good, he thought, and he was looking for like-minded people that might know something else about what was in store for us. And eventually, of course, he came to the League of Rights, where he found that they knew what was really going on. And in due course, he joined the League, and for the last 23 years, he has been speaking on the League platform. In the course of that time, he has spoken, as well as in Australia, overseas, Britain, Ireland, Canada, New Zealand. And in travelling around this country, when you remember that he came here as a stranger, he had to learn all about our history, he had to learn all about our political system, and he had to learn a lot about Australians. And I don't know of anybody that knows more about Australia, geographically, politically, or any other way you like to mention than Jeremy. In fact, I would go as far as to say that historically and politically, he knows more about Australia than all the politicians put together. And I'm often reminded of that when I thought I knew something about our history. Every now and again he comes up to remind me about something that I don't know. Well, of course, in the course of his job and activities, basically he was alerting Australians to the threat to their freedom, or their liberty, however you like to put it. And one would have thought that anybody trying to defend the liberty of a nation would be quite a celebrity, would be getting plenty of headlines, but in this case not so. In fact, the more he spoke about this and the further he went and the more evidence was produced from the point of view of the nation's media, the more he was damned. And I think, as a lot of you here would have experienced, one of the most difficult things in this day and age is to talk publicly, and particularly through the press and the TV and the radio, about anything to do at all with our liberties and its origins. And that brings us to the reason for this meeting tonight. And Jeremy's going to tell us what's behind this attack that has been made on himself and the League recently under parliamentary privilege by one Senator Boswell. Now, what Senator Boswell said was bad enough and incorrect enough, but of course the media took this up and extended the smear and the lie about what Jeremy's been doing. And to those of you who know what he's been talking about for 20 years, what he's written about and what goes on endlessly, it's always amazing that that sort of thing is never spoken about by the media. They have their story and they're sticking to it, and it's the very opposite to what Jeremy has been saying. So in order to set this record straight, Jeremy is going to deal with this matter, this latest attack, and that is being videoed tonight, and it will also be audio taped, and we hope to be able to distribute this message all over Australia. Because by the sound of it, they're getting pretty desperate, and we know now that the larger part of the thinking part of this nation has woken up and is at last starting to do something about it. So, ladies and gentlemen, with those remarks, would you please welcome Jeremy Lee.
Well, Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to start by expressing my appreciation to those of you who've come here tonight from such a wide diversity of areas. As the Chairman said, from many parts of Queensland as far north as North Queensland, where I had the opportunity to lecture recently. And it is certainly gratifying and pleasing to me that you are so concerned about what is going on, that you would have made the effort, many of you farmers, others in business, to take the time to travel here to Toowoomba at this time in our bicentenary year to hear an address on this particular issue. Now, as the Chairman has pointed out, I've been lecturing now around Australia for about 21 years. I've lectured, I think, in every state. I've been many times round this country, and obviously anybody during that time who is lecturing on controversial issues concerning our political future and our constitution and the way that we live, must expect to put up with disagreements, with attacks, and that certainly has been the lot of a speaker in the League of Rights. I've suffered, the same as other speakers in the League of Rights have suffered, some quite damning attacks. But the recent attack by Senator Boswell is different to anything that I've experienced before for one simple reason. And that reason is that Senator Boswell has launched his attack in Parliament as a Christian and made it quite clear that he was speaking as a Christian. In fact, he concluded his long address in the Parliament. He was given 2 extensions of time to make his statement with a biblical quote, and made it clear that he was speaking in appeal to fellow Christians, warning them that they must not have anything to do with what I was saying, not hear what I was saying, and that this was important because he felt they were being deceived by not only my own message, but also that of the League of Rights. And that means it's difficult, because if one is going to argue with a Christian, and my position is that I also claim the Christian faith, I have accepted Christ, it raises the matter into an arena that should, at any rate, be slightly above the normal battles that go on in the body politic. We're exhorted as Christians, before we debate each other or challenge each other publicly, to seek some way of reconciliation. Matthew chapter 18 makes it quite clear that Christians should try and reconcile themselves with their fellows as far as possible, which makes it extraordinary in my eyes that I've never been approached by word or by letter by Senator Boswell, as one Christian to another, before that attack was launched and the wide publicity which crossed this nation was given to it. It also means that I must try and answer in kind, and therefore I would like to start by saying that I have nothing against Senator Boswell personally. I respect his Christian faith. I am convinced that he believes what he's saying. I deplore the fact that he has not checked his sources, nor does he understand from whence that attack has come. But nevertheless, I am prepared to concede that he was genuine in what he said, and I hope that through what I reply tonight, we are able to develop this argument and this bone of contention to a point where it is enlightening not only for myself and Senator Boswell, but for the many hundreds of Christians who are concerned about what is going on in this country, and that in turn, I hope, should lead to a higher level of political involvement. Before dealing with the essence of what Senator Boswell said, I'd like to try and set some background on the events that have happened and which lead up to it. Events which by any measure are extraordinary. They are simply the events that have occurred in this state of Queensland in the period of just under 2 years, about 19 months. They've happened with such rapidity that many people have been at a loss to explain just why they've happened or quite how it's been arranged. So may I simply go through a number of dates and point out what has happened to try and enlighten and remind you just where we are at this particular time. We start in the month of October 1986, just about 19 months ago. October 1986, Sir Joe Jelke-Peterson leads the National Party to yet one more decisive victory in this state against all predictions and opinion polls. And you might remember, every opinion poll was predicting an enormous defeat for him. We had many of the pundits running night after night campaigns of vilification against the Premier. But in the face of all that, he led the party to yet one more decisive victory in the state. And so remarkable was that victory that the editorial in the Australian on November the 3rd, 1986, said this: "The triumph of the National Party, especially when it is borne in mind that it has led the government of Queensland for 30 years, is one of the most extraordinary feats in the history of Australian politics." And I believe that was right. We moved from there to early 1987. Sir Joe Jelke-Peterson, the Premier, at the urging, so the press told us, of Sir Robert Sparks, commences a Joe for Canberra campaign. Many, including the League of Rights, warn Sir Joe he is being led into a trap. Perhaps at this point I should just make clear my own position with regard to the League of Rights. Having spoken for them and been one of their representatives for the last 21 years, I resigned from the League of Rights at the beginning of this year. Now, when I say I resigned from the League of Rights, I resigned from my full-time position as Assistant National Director and the Secretary of the Institute of Economic Democracy. But I want to make it absolutely clear that the reasons for that resignation in no sense represent a repudiation of what the League is or what it stands for. I still hold a normal membership in the League. I support its objectives. I have many friends who I respect highly amongst its ranks. And the reasons for my resignation were simply that there were so many pressures from so many directions that I was unable to cope with all the responsibilities involved in that full-time position. But nevertheless, many of you would remember at the time that that Joe campaign was launched, that I held a meeting here in Toowoomba attended by very nearly 1,000 people, in which I warned Sir Joe that I believed he was being led into a trap, and that the campaign would founder simply because those involved in its organisation did not really have the interests either of the party or, I believe, of the nation truly at heart, and therefore Sir Joe would be well advised to call off that campaign and to continue with the tremendous job he was doing as State Premier. I mention that because shortly afterwards I was lecturing down in New South Wales, and in the town of Maclean on the north coast in New South Wales, one of those in a very big audience I spoke to produced a set of anonymous notes which had been sent to them by their local National Party member, in which it was alleged that Sir Joe was doing enormous damage to the National Party and that his move to Canberra was firmly supported by the League of Rights. The address that I gave in Toowoomba gave the lie to that particular report. So I wrote to Mr. Causley, the National Party member down there, and pointed out that his information was totally false, and I deplored the fact that the notes were being published anonymously. I subsequently discovered that they were reprinted in the National Party newspaper in New South Wales under the name of Sir Adrian Solomons, the senior National Party member in the Legislative Council in New South Wales, and it was a direct opposite of what we had been advising. It's simply another example of the enormous misrepresentation that has occurred since that time. April 1987, Prime Minister Hawke, breaking earlier promises, announces an early election. Sir Joe, left high and dry by the National Farmers Federation President Ian McLaughlin, who had originally said that he would stand with him, and hopeless organisation from Sir Robert Sparks, the President of the Queensland National Party, was finally forced to abandon the Canberra campaign. July the 11th, 1987, Hawke romps home again in Canberra, untroubled by totally inept federal opposition led by Mr. Howard and Mr. Sinclair, who were divided, fighting, and completely in disarray. The second half of 1987, open warfare broke out between Sir Joe and Sir Robert Sparks. Sir Robert Sparks' constant niggling aimed at replacing Sir Joe with Mr. Ahern, and we had a perpetuation of that for some months, which I think disgusted and dismayed many Queenslanders. December 1987, Sir Joe, after being hopelessly undermined within his own party, finally capitulates and is replaced by Mr. Ahern. Thus, Queensland's greatest leader, who only 14 months previously had led his party to what the Australian newspaper called one of the most extraordinary feats in Australian politics, was ousted from office by power-hungry predators within his own party machine. February 1988, the federal member for this particular seat, the seat of Groom, Mr. Tom McVeigh, resigned, and a by-election was due on April the 9th. March the 11th, 1988, the Courier Mail came out with front-page headlines, "Nat's boss tackles League of Rights." Sir Robert Sparks, I believe, hoping to create an imaginary right-wing bogeyman to retrieve the falling popularity of the Nationals, made the totally untruthful claim that the League was infiltrating National Party branches, a claim, incidentally, which has repeatedly been made and has been totally unfounded. March the 14th, 1988, the Australian Labor Party quickly picks up the Sparks smear. Labor finance spokesman de Lacey claimed that Jeremy Lee, and I was at that time lecturing up in North Queensland, was causing unnecessary fears about the world heritage in North Queensland, and quoted Sir Robert Sparks as the evidence that I was to be totally discredited. So we have the Labor Party quoting Sir Robert Sparks for its particular ends. That night, between 450 and 500 people packed into the Atherton Hall to hear an address by myself, including many National Party members, who told me at the meeting that they had been the subject of a telephone campaign right across the tablelands, warning them not to come to the meeting. And although that did not mean that they endorsed the League of Rights, they told me they were damned if they were going to be told who they could listen to, and many had come for that very reason. I think it probably doubled the size of the audience. March the 15th, here in Toowoomba, while I was in North Queensland, the press reported that a coalition movement of organisations called Australians Speaking Up had launched in Toowoomba a campaign for a Swiss-style voters' veto in a hall packed with 1,000 people. The speakers were given a standing ovation. On the same day, the Courier Mail quoted the State Director of the League of Rights here in Queensland, Mr. Chas Pinwell, replying to the untrue accusation of Sir Robert Sparks and pointing out the hypocrisy of the National Party, who in several previous elections had approached the League of Rights to man their voting booths in the metropolitan areas because they couldn't get enough of their own supporters to do so. The approach, incidentally, to the League of Rights was made by Senator Ron Boswell, and in order to endorse him, at one stage the Premier himself had phoned through asking for League of Rights help. And Mr. Pinwell has pointed out that as many as 30 voting booths were manned, both with the knowledge and the request of Sir Robert Sparks, the Premier, and Senator Boswell during that particular time. April the 9th, the Toowoomba by-election was held. The Nationals lost the blue ribbon seat with a swing exceeding 20%. Media articles claimed that the National candidate, David Russell, was damaged by being seen as Sir Robert Sparks's protégé. Sir Joe added fuel by campaigning against the Nationals for the Liberal candidate. Panic set into the National Party after the Chronicle headline claimed the result was a slap in the face for the Nationals. April the 17th, a by-election in Sir Joe's old seat of Baramba. The Nationals suffered a stunning defeat with a swing exceeding 30%. In fact, it was nearly 35%. The independent candidate, Trevor Perrott, won on a policy advocating the Swiss-style citizens' referenda, which was the same issue that had been launched in that campaign in Toowoomba some time earlier. April the 21st, 1988, the latest Morgan Gallup poll, which was published in the Courier Mail on that date, 21st, showed a massive slump in the National Party popularity throughout Australia. With only 7% support, it was trailing the Democrats by 2%. April the 22nd, 1988, shocked National Party Management Committee meets in Roma. The Weekend Australian, April the 23rd to the 24th, reported Ahern dragging the Nats to the left. And it went on, the Queensland Premier, Mr. Ahern, and the National Party President, Sir Robert Sparks, were warned they had created disaffection in the branch power base by taking the party too far to the left at the pre-Central Council Management Committee meeting in Roma yesterday. April the 25th, 1988, the Australian reports Queensland Premier Mike Ahern as favouring the Swiss voters' veto concept, while Sir Robert Sparks was strongly opposed. April the 26th, 1988, the Financial Review reported as follows. The Queensland National Party has been courting the newly elected independent state member for Baramba, Mr. Trevor Perrott, in an attempt to ward off a split within the party. The Premier, Mr. Ahern, has revealed his government is considering introducing the fundamental plank of Mr. Perrott's campaign, a Swiss-style citizens-initiated referenda. Little more than a week ago, Mr. Ahern criticised Mr. Perrott as a candidate with League of Rights-type policies. Like the Premier, the party appears to have reversed its attitude to Mr. Perrott over the weekend. If ever there was a sign of a party in total disarray, you could see it in that chain of events. But that was not the end. April the 27th, 1988, Senator Boswell, the man who sought with Sir Robert Sparks's backing the League of Rights' help in manning National Party voting booths in the metropolitan areas, makes an emotional speech in the Senate which is quoted widely in the media, accusing the League of Rights of a multitude of sins, including Nazi sympathies, anti-Semitism, spreading propaganda, distorting the implications of the World Heritage issue, and campaigning against democracy. He says the Swiss citizens-initiated referenda idea will only benefit the League of Rights. He is supported in Parliament by Senators Boehm, Lewis and John Stone. Now, this leaves me in an incredible situation because on the one hand, we have a senator from the National Party claiming that this move, the citizens-initiated referenda, is only going to benefit groups like the League of Rights, and we'll get on to the substance of that attack a little bit later on. We have the Queensland National Party, which is the same party led by Premier Ahern, now coming out in favour of the thing. We have the Liberal Party in New South Wales, which claims to be supporting the Swiss-style citizens-initiated referenda. We have the issuing by the Liberal Party in Canberra of a green paper looking at ways and means of introducing it. We have the Constitutional Commission, which has conceded that it had more submissions in favour of the Swiss-type citizens' referenda than any other single issue during the time that it was taking evidence. And yet with all that, plus the fact that over 102 different associations have now endorsed that idea, including the Country Women's Association of Australia, the Returned Servicemen's League of Australia, we have Senator Boswell claiming in the Senate that the Swiss citizens-initiated referenda, which simply gives the people the right to have a particular say on policies of great concern, is only going to benefit the League of Rights. May I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that that's about the level of the substance of the attacks that he has raised. So I would like, therefore, to go a little bit further and to try and deal, therefore, with some of the background to this attack. Perhaps I could just go a little bit further in pointing out some of the activities which surrounded the election of Mr. Trevor Perrott, that is, the independent member in the seat of Baramba, who ousted the National Party by 35%. This came out in the South Bernard Times on April the 27th. That was the day that Senator Boswell made his attack. The member for Baramba, Mr. Trevor Perrott, has rejected a National Party policy of tagging him extreme right-wing. He said such a term, used by the Premier, Mr. Mike Ahern, and the party's Baramba candidate, Mr. Warren Truss, was an insult to him and the 31.5% of Baramba people who gave him their number one vote. Mr. Perrott said the National Party's vindictive use of the term ultra-right-wing and extreme right-wing had led to him being labelled fascist and communist in interstate media. He was disappointed that Mr. Truss had used the term extreme right-wing description when conceding defeat last Wednesday. Mr. Perrott said his pre-election pledge had been to serve God, Queen and Baramba people in Parliament, yet he had been branded a right-wing ratbag. He said the Baramba Citizens Electoral Council, which had chosen him as its candidate and helped him conduct his campaign, was committed to citizens-initiated referendum, thereby reducing the power of parties and politicians as the sole instigators of referendums on controversial issues. I have also committed myself to represent the majority of the people of Baramba and move for democratic self-government. How can that be interpreted as being left or right-wing? Mr. Truss, Sir Robert Sparks and Mr. Ahern had better do a little more homework to get their facts straight and cease insulting the intelligence of Baramba voters. The mainline political parties have been staggered and worried that the people have rejected the party politics style of government, and those parties have resorted to name-calling to discredit this movement for democratic, free government of the people by the people of Baramba. Mr. Craig Isherwood, chairman of the Baramba Citizens Electoral Council, also condemned the name-calling by the National Party. He said Mr. Truss, Mr. Ahern and Sir Robert Sparks were using an array of political terminology which they did not appear to understand. This movement, Mr. Perrott and his supporters, have been branded by these three National Party people as extreme right-wing, a term which clearly they do not understand. The extreme right-wing is fascism. It can also be called National Socialism, as it was under Hitler. Those political ideologies are no different to communism, and the use of the term is just a deceptive way of confusing and dividing the people. Mr. Ahern, Mr. Truss and Sir Robert are inferring that a big proportion of Baramba electors support Nazism when they use the words extreme right-wing to describe Mr. Perrott and this movement. That is an insult to the people of this electorate, many of whom supported the National Party for nearly 40 years. Surely that must make the party a National Socialist Party if those National Party officials accuse the people of Baramba of such things. I thought there was some logic in that. But nevertheless, what do you make of party leaders who campaign against a man with a good public record, Mr. Trevor Perrott, by calling him names like that, and then are reported a little bit later on in the Financial Review as follows? The Premier, Mr. Ahern, has revealed his government is considering introducing the fundamental plank of Mr. Perrott's campaign, a Swiss-style citizens-initiated referenda under which about 5% of electors could send issues of contention to a public vote. Little more than a week ago, Mr. Ahern criticised Mr. Perrott as a candidate with League of Rights-type policies. Like the Premier, the party appears to have reversed its attitude to Mr. Perrott over the weekend, and they're now wooing him. And in fact, a Central Council meeting in Roma indicated he should expect efforts to get Mr. Perrott on side with the Nationals and even attempts to entice him back into the party. Well, really, it's quite sickening. It's really quite sickening. And all I'm trying to do is point out that name-calling has reached such dimensions that until we begin to see the awful political campaigning behind it, it really means nothing but bewilderment to the people that are involved. But I'd like to take you back a little bit to show that what has come out as a result of the Boswell attack is not new in Australia. This is a progressive thing that has developed for a long period of time. Most of it has been directed against one man, the National Director of the Australian League of Rights, Eric Butler. And I want to go on record straight away as saying that he is a man I respect enormously, have a deep friendship for, and a man who has suffered character assassination to a degree that I believe nobody else in Australia has suffered. So I want to tell you something about his background, or the background to the attack. The first time this type of attack ever came out was during the war, when the Communist Party of Australia made a major announcement that Eric Butler must be destroyed at all costs. And the way that that destruction was to be perpetrated was to discredit him as far as possible. The first attempt publicly where that was ever made was at a time when Mr. Butler was a member of the Anglican Synod in Melbourne. He was a strong church member, and an anonymous document was then circulated round trying to discredit a resolution that he had put before the Synod which pointed out that Christianity and communism were totally incompatible. To their credit, members of the Anglican Synod at that time totally rejected anonymous accusations that were made against him. That was then followed by the first major national attack against the League of Rights, which came out in 1965 with the publication of a little book called Voices of Hate. Voices of Hate was written by a journalist by the name of Mr. K.D. Gott. Now, it also happened that Mr. Gott was a former member of the Communist Party of Australia, had left it, and has since that time been a prominent member of the Fabian Society. The little book was published by the Dissent Publishing House, which was affiliated with the Fabian movement, and it was circulated surreptitiously. The reply that the League gave was to buy as many copies as it could, and it sold them on its bookstands to point out the type of smear that was going on. And so right up until that particular time, the only attacks that were made against either Eric Butler or against the League of Rights had come through the communist left-wing movement. But it gained a much more serious aspect as we moved into the early 1970s. May I just point out that my own background was this was happening at a time when I wasn't even in Australia. And I had come to Australia in 1962, and it was in 1965 that I gave the first paper, just as a voluntary ordinary citizen, at a League of Rights seminar, which was a paper on my own home country and what had happened there. And from there I got more and more interested and in agreement with what the League was saying, which I thought was important, and it was in 1967 that I took on my position as a full-time speaker with them. 1965, the year that I gave my first paper for the League of Rights, was the year that the Fabian Society and its former communist had published the scurrilous little booklet, Voices of Hate. And so to satisfy myself, although I didn't really need much satisfaction, I'd already convinced myself, I wrote to the Attorney General of Australia at that time, Mr. Snedden, and I asked him for any information that he could give me on the League of Rights, and on the 14th of September 1965 I received the following reply. Dear Mr. Lee, further to your letter of the 12th of August and my reply on the 19th of August, I would advise that the Australian League of Rights exists in all states and has its headquarters in Victoria. The basic aims of the League are 1. Loyalty to the Crown, 2. Support for constitutional government, 3. Support for free enterprise, 4. Opposition to all forms of totalitarianism, particularly communism. The Australian League of Rights, which is situated on the 3rd floor of the Pressgrave Building, 73 Little Collins Street, Melbourne, publishes a monthly journal intelligence survey, a monthly paper, The New Times, and a weekly news bulletin on Target. There is no evidence to suggest that the Australian League of Rights is anything other than a reputable organisation. Yours sincerely, B. M. Snedden, Attorney General of Australia. I'd have thought that was reasonable. Obviously it was an organisation with which you could disagree, and perhaps disagree strongly, but by no stretch of imagination could it be called subversive, anti-democratic, or anything of the sort. Its objectives were quite clear and have remained the same until the present time. That was 1965. 1971, we had come into a point of widespread disagreement with the old Country Party. And the main issue over which we had come into disagreement was the tremendous rural crisis, with the loss of many farmers, which we attributed, rightly or wrongly, to the growth of interest rates, high taxes, and an inevitable cost-price squeeze. And we were pointing out that if this was allowed to continue, there would come a time in Australia's future when the family farm as we knew it would be in total jeopardy in this nation. We went further than that in saying that the body which should be fighting for the farmer was really neglecting the issues which were destroying him, and this produced a tremendous ferment in many National Party branches. I was invited to speak to many. We had people who were interested in what we were saying, not necessarily members of the League of Rights at all, simply ordinary farmers who also had membership of the National or the Country Party as it was then, and were expressing that concern in resolutions demanding that something was done to try and save the family farm. And the pressure on the National Party was so intense that in the middle of 1971 at the South Australian Country Party conference, the National Party leader, Mr. Doug Anthony, suggested that the League of Rights was a Nazi-style movement which was causing disaffection in Country Party areas. And that produced immediately a furore. Great meetings were held, there was a lot of controversy, asked to produce evidence. A document without any authorship was circulated round anonymously, although many Country Party people denied its existence, which had been fed into the party from a newspaper called Nation Review that had strong left-wing links and which must have been very satisfied for the first time to see material that had originally had its source in the Communist Party now being peddled by the Country Party without any understanding of where it had come from. And so big meetings were held to try and get the truth out, and it ended up with a number of things happening. The first thing that happened was a debate out in Dalby, not very far from here, attended by I think the number was close to 1,000 people, although the press reports varied between 600 and 800, at which the national director, Mr. Eric Butler, debated a man who claimed not only that we were Nazi, but that we'd been holding Ku Klux Klan meetings throughout the Darling Downs, if you please. Can you imagine me dressed in a white, hooded figure? I don't think Fletcher Jones make that style any longer. The Toowoomba Chronicle here in this country on the 5th of the 11th, 1970, came out with this report. More than 600 people applauded Mr. Eric Butler, National Director of the Australian League of Rights, when, at the end of a debate in Dalby last night, he produced evidence the League was a reputable organisation. Mr. Butler, after presenting the proof, asked for a public apology from Mr. Ron Bainish, a Galuga bar grain grower who had argued that the League was a subversive organisation. And so it went on. That then ended up with this article coming out in the Courier Mail on the 8th of August, 1971. It makes amazing reading when you go back and have a look at it now. The Country Party's State Management Committee yesterday disassociated itself from any allegation that the League of Rights was pro-Nazi. I'd just like to repeat that. The Country Party's State Management Committee yesterday disassociated itself from any allegation that the League of Rights was pro-Nazi. The committee, the party's beg your pardon, I can't just quite read that. The committee, the party's executive in Queensland, spent much of yesterday morning discussing the League's influence on the Country Party. The party's state president, Mr. Robert Sparks, moved successfully to disassociate the party from the Nazi allegations. It seems staggering to me that a management committee, which, having looked into the whole issue of what had happened and the charges that were made and the sources from which they had come, and which then publicly disassociated itself from that allegation, should be sitting quietly by now while the same allegations are made under the privilege of Parliament by Senator Boswell at the present time. It seems to me to be absolutely disgusting. So that's how it happened. One or two National Party members came out strongly repudiating what Mr. Anthony was saying, and incidentally, Mr. Anthony himself later withdrew the allegation about the League of Rights being pro-Nazi, although that was never reported in the media. Even the Nation Review, this left-wing paper, had to say, writing in that particular issue, Mr. Jim Corbett had disassociated himself from the Sinclair attack. This was confirmed by Jim Corbett, the member for Maranoa, just out here. He said that a lot of very fine people who support the League worked for me in the last election and denied that the organisation was in any way anti-Semitic or pro-Nazi. So the attack died down. The attack died down until 1984. And the issue which then rearranged that attack or produced it in a different form was the great battle that broke out at that particular time over Aboriginal land rights. And the issue which brought it to a fore was the introduction of a bill in Victoria called the Aboriginal Land Claims Bill, which, had it been implemented, would have allowed 1/3 of the state of Victoria to be handed over to the Aboriginal population, including private property, which at that stage had a population, Aboriginal population, of round about the 4,000 mark, 1/3 of the state. So I was lecturing flat out, night after night after night, to very big meetings, and they were getting bigger and bigger. I spoke to meetings of many Aborigines, and I spoke to meetings of local councils throughout Victoria, and the result of that was I simply presented the evidence of what the bill was proposing, tried to point out what was behind the attack, and at the same time that that was going on, we had my boss, as he was then, Eric Butler, going round lecturing together with a gentleman by the name of Mr. Jeff MacDonald. I'd just briefly like to remind you about Jeff MacDonald, an outstanding individual who'd been a former member of the Communist Party. He was brought up in the Communist Party, subsequently left it, but before leaving it, he had been involved in training schools in Minto that is, their training headquarters in New South Wales, and in those training schools they had been taught and trained in how to use the issue of Aboriginal land rights to produce ferment and revolution in Australia. And later, when he left the party, he saw many of the activities which he had formerly been trained to produce coming through the Department of Aboriginal Affairs in Canberra under Mr. Clyde Holding. And he began to speak out and finally produced a book called Red Over Black, which became a popular bestseller right throughout this country, sold thousands of copies. And incidentally, many of those copies were bought by the National Party, which itself had not done anything to expose what was going on. Eric Butler and Jeff MacDonald were going around lecturing at that time. I was lecturing separately. And finally, in total disarray, the Victorian government that was back on the ropes did a number of things. The first thing it did was that it sent a letter to all councils throughout Victoria warning them in the strongest possible terms that they were not allowed to have a League of Rights speaker. Well, the reaction, as you can imagine, knowing the independence of Australians, was that the number of invitations from councils to League speakers doubled and then tripled. They didn't necessarily agree, but they wanted to find out, and they weren't going to be told by politicians who they could listen to and who they could not listen to. So that was then followed immediately by a blistering attack, again under the privilege of Parliament, by the left-wing minister down there, Mr. Ken Coghill, in the Kane government, which was reported in the press on the 2nd of November 1984 as follows. The League of Rights was yesterday linked with Japanese propaganda during World War II and subversion of Australian security. State Parliament was told that the League's national president, Mr. Eric Butler, undermined the Australian war effort. I've never heard such an atrocious claim in my life. The Secretary to Cabinet, Dr. Ken Coghill, alleged this was shown by documents found in the Japanese consulate in Sydney when it was closed in 1941. Now, I want to tell you that Eric Butler had an honourable war record. He served up in the islands on active service, was then taken from there and ended the war as an instructor at an army officer training school down in Melbourne, Victoria, I beg your pardon, in Seymour, just outside, had an honourable discharge. No allegation had ever been made of that nature to him before, and here under the privilege of Parliament, by a left-winger who probably wasn't even born at the time this was going on, that allegation was made. But it didn't stop there. Within minutes of that speech being made in Parliament, the press arrived down at RSL headquarters and immediately confronted Mr. Bruce Ruxton, the state president of the RSL. What have you got to say about the allegation that Eric Butler was undermining the war effort during the war and supporting the Japanese? Bruce Ruxton, who knew nothing about what had been said, hadn't even heard the report, simply made the common sense reply, well, I don't know what it's all about, but I'll ask you a question. If that's true, why wasn't he court-martialed? And that was the end, of course, of what the press had to say, because had it been true, he would have been court-martialed long ago. But it didn't end there. That was immediately followed by an extraordinary article that came out in the Australian and the Sydney, I think it was the Australian, by a very well-known Australian by the name of Mr. Philip Adams. Mr. Philip Adams is an interesting gentleman. He's a former member of the Communist Party, like K.D. Gott, who wrote the original book. He's also a prominent member of the Fabian Society. Last year, he was nominated as the Humanist of the Year in this country. Virulently anti-Christian, he lampoons, ridicules Christianity at every opportunity. The article, which came out in the Australian, November the 3rd to the 4th, 1984, was headed a catalogue of wrongs from the right and named 4 Bs who were ruining Australia. They were Mr. Eric Butler, Professor Geoffrey Blaney, Mr. John Bennett, the Melbourne lawyer who was the president of the Council of Civil Liberties, and the last one was Mr. Bruce Ruxton. It was a vitriolic letter which went on to suggest that Eric had been under a cloud for helping the Japanese during the war, and that this had all come out and that it was only a matter of time before the documentary evidence came through. Just happened that Eric Butler was overseas at the time, so I replied at length to the Australian, simply categorising Eric's war record, pointing out some of the nature of what had been going on, that this was absolute nonsense, which the Australian refused to publish. And so with no recourse, I had to take the matter to the Australian Press Council, and finally it ended up before the Australian Press Council, who made a finding which the Australian had rather abjectly to publish later on, that they had committed a gross impropriety by not printing the reply that I had given to Mr. Philip Adams, the noted former communist, cum Fabian, cum humanist, who had alleged that Eric Butler, with his honourable war record, had been supporting the Japanese during the last war. And that's about the level of attacks that we've been getting until quite recently, when all of a sudden Senator Boswell, who had originally asked for our help in manning voting booths, who had done nothing to examine the disassociation by Sir Robert Sparks with those allegations earlier on, had done nothing to check the source of the accusations he made, got up under the privilege of Parliament on April the 28th, and had begun to repeat the same allegations. So what I'd like to do is just briefly go through what the allegations were, and I suppose I had hoped actually that I would be able to play you the full tape of Senator Boswell's speech in Parliament, but it's so long that we'd be here all night. So I think the best I can do is to read to you the article which appeared in The Age on April the 28th, 1988, as a report of what Mr. Boswell had to say. Beware League of Rights, churches told. Churches and civic organisations were warned yesterday not to become pawns of the racist and neo-Nazi League of Rights. Senator Ron Boswell, National Party Queensland, launched the scathing attack on the League, saying it was growing rapidly and could no longer be ignored. He told the Senate yesterday that he had been briefly an innocent vehicle for the League. He had assumed that the League upheld many of the principles for which the National Party stood. But after finding out more about its activities, he had alerted party colleagues. This led the Queensland president of the party, Sir Robert Sparks, to write to state National Party MPs last month warning that the League was trying to infiltrate their ranks. Totally untrue, but it made the headlines. Senator Boswell said the League would not tell its followers it was racist, anti-Semitic and neo-Nazi. This is the essence and the dark side of the League of Rights. He said the organisation's public face was for God, Queen and country. However, the extremist side of the League's activity was introduced insidiously and by degrees through networks of front organisations, books and pamphlets. Cassettes and videos are the new weapons in their armoury. The League's national director, Eric Butler, said in Perth last night that Senator Boswell had been a link between the League and the National Party. The Nationals had asked the League to hand out how-to-vote cards in Brisbane polling booths before it had established an effective organisation in the metropolitan area. Mr. Butler accused Senator Boswell of being a front man for Sir Robert and said the National Party was rapidly losing support after the sacking of the former Premier Sir Joe Joly-Peterson. Senator Boswell said that he might inadvertently have launched a book for the League. The invitation had not come directly from the organisation, but the book was published by Veritas Press, which he had since found to be closely connected with the League. He said he had seen an alarming escalation in the League's activities in the past 12 months. Churches were being used as innocent vehicles to spread the organisation's message. As a committed Christian, I find it particularly repulsive that the League has recently chosen to penetrate the churches, particularly as the League, through Butler's writings, has promoted the heretical belief that Jesus Christ was not a Jew. I warn all pastors and ministers not to allow their churches to be used as a platform for the organisation who relish denigrating Parliament and promote a world conspiracy theory and social credit as the panacea to all their worldly problems. He said the League's most established front organisations have been the Institute for Economic Democracy, Ladies in Line Against Communism, the Christian Institute for Individual Freedom, the Australian Heritage Society and the Conservative Speakers Club. Senator Boswell said he had only recently realised the League's true aims, particularly after seeing its agitation amongst North Queensland timber workers, and put out of jobs by the World Heritage nomination of rainforests. He said the League told communities under stress their problems were caused by international conspiracies. The League of Rights is the Pied Piper of Australian politics. It draws upright, hard-working men and women closer to its inner circle and hidden agenda. North Queensland timber workers were being told by the League of a plan by Jewish bankers to take over their lands and forests, he said. That was the substance of the attack. I'd like then briefly to go through the actual essence of his attack as recorded in the Hansard, and then give you some sort of reply to show how ridiculous it is. But just before doing that, I'd like to just deal with the question, in the meantime, what had happened to the guy who'd started all this going, which was the little communist, or former communist, cum Fabian, Mr. K.D. Gott, who'd written The Voices of Hate. Well, following the great campaign we had with Philip Adams and the Labour Party in Victoria over Aboriginal land rights, believe it or not, Mr. Ken Gott was then put on the public payroll of the Commonwealth Government by Mr. Clyde Holding. And this came out in the Sydney Morning Herald on July the 23rd, 1984, and I'd just like to read to you what it says. The extreme right-wing organisation, the Australian League of Rights, is undergoing a revival based on its new campaign against Aboriginal land rights and Asian immigration. The League's growing support is worrying the federal government to the extent that it has hired a full-time consultant, Mr. Ken Gott, an expert on the League, to prepare a dossier as the basis of government strategy to combat the League's efforts. So we have a federal government now employing little former communist cum Fabian to produce a special campaign to counter the efforts of the League of Rights, would you believe? The National Director of the League, well, it then goes on to explain what Mr. Gott was doing. Mr. Gott, a former business journalist, it doesn't mention, of course, he was a former communist, consultant with CRA, has been studying the League's activities for many years and will update his 1965 book on the League's activities, Voices of Hate, etc., etc. Mr. Gott said he was approached by the Federal Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Mr. Holding, earlier this year to take up a 6-month contract to help counter the League's sponsorship of a campaign against Aboriginal land rights. The League was behind a series of recent meetings in Victoria, some attended by prominent state Liberal and National Party members, to fight the proposed Victorian land rights legislation. The opposition leader, Mr. Kennett, has refused to follow the lead of the Premier, Mr. Kane, who has banned government members from speaking at meetings organised by the League. Mr. Gott said the League had been a bloody menace to the Liberals by pressuring selected candidates on the race issue. The League is attracting a growing number of country people who think its ideas throw great light on things they do not understand. It is all incredible nonsense, but decent, honest Australians are getting sucked in. Mr. Gott accused the League of being dedicated to racism and racial hatred and said that in the present economic circumstances with relatively high unemployment, there was a great potential for racist groups to make headway. Marvellous propaganda for the left wing, because they never pointed out that while that was being said, Eric Butler was at that time travelling round with the most courageous full-blood Aboriginal pastor from the Christian Church, Cedric Jacobs. Cedric Jacobs was the author of a little book published by the Veritas Publishing Company, which Senator Boswell has attacked, called Healing a Divided Nation. It's a most tremendous Christian appeal from an Aboriginal full-blood. He was a guest up here in my home. I was privileged to have Cedric Jacobs. But nevertheless, those things are hidden, and we're accused of racism in the progress of what we're going to do. I might tell you it was also the same time that the book Red Over Black was being sold, which was launched in Brisbane by Sir Joe Jelke-Peterson. So here we have Mr. Boswell attacking the publishing company which attacks, or which had printed the books, first of all published by an Aboriginal full-blood pastor, secondly by a former communist, which was launched by the Queensland Premier. It becomes more and more incredible. It becomes even more incredible when you realise that 10 days before the Boswell attack in the federal parliament, I was sharing a platform down just south of Brisbane with one of the National Party cabinet ministers in the Queensland Parliament. We were both on the same platform. He came out and supported the voters' veto. I won't give you his name because presumably Senator Boswell will be attacking him next. But he was a prominent cabinet member under Mr. Ahern, who incidentally also said that a book which had been published by the Queensland government, which was really putting an answer to the Constitutional Commission, had had its funds withdrawn due to pressure from management here in Queensland. It's quite incredible. So at one meeting you're on the platform with cabinet ministers from the National Party. Second, you're having people from the National Party at meetings down in Victoria and Liberals, as pointed out by that article. The next you're being attacked by National Party senators in the Senate. It's quite ridiculous. Quite ridiculous. It's become absolutely farcical. It's very little wonder that the National Party is just sliding downhill into ignominious defeat. All right, well, let's go to some of the accusations that he made, because they need answering. And all I can do, therefore, is to go through some of the issues which have come out in Hansard that Senator Boswell himself has raised. I can't go through the whole thing. There's so much of it. Most of it is fairly nonsensical. So I'll just read. These are the exact words of Senator Boswell now in the Senate. I personally was briefly an innocent vehicle on 11th of March. The Courier Mail carried a headline, Nat's boss tackles League of Rights. The League responded by replying that I had asked the League to man polling booths. I subsequently made a statement to this House in the affirmative. I also may have launched a book for them, although the invitation to do so did not come from the League itself. I found later the book was published by Veritas Press, which my research has shown me to be closely connected to the League, so that now I assume it may have been a League publication. His research is pretty miserable because there is no connection between the League of Rights and Veritas Publishing. We buy their books, we think they're very good, but there is no direct connection. He then goes on, I have since learned a lot more about the League and have devoted the resources available to me to find out the truth about the League and what it really stands for. Well, I just hope that that is not true. Because if Senator Boswell has genuinely researched the League, then some of the things he says subsequently are genuinely untrue. I can only hope he's been misled, and I will be charitable enough to say that that probably is the true position. The League's public face is for God, Queen and country and support for state rights, free enterprise, the Constitution, the family farm and small business. It is only natural that many decent men and women are attracted to these objectives, which are laudable and noble. However, the extremer side of the League is introduced insidiously by degrees through its extensive network of organisations and with the aid of offset printing presses to produce masses of literature. Now cassettes and videos are the new weapons in their armoury. League speakers travel to targeted groups, hiring halls where necessary. Though seldom flouting the League's name, they are skillful and articulate speakers and speak with authority on both local issues, national and international economic and political issues. That's just not true. I want to tell you that at every single opportunity when I was speaking with the League, I tried to ensure that I was publicised as a League speaker. And I'll try and give you an example of how vicious that allegation is. I was speaking down at Gilganra in 1985 and was approached by the ABC, who asked permission whether they could come and film the meeting that was taking place. The actual guy, the programme was countrywide, and the reporter who came out to do the filming was Mr. Ross Bill. I'd never been to Gilganra before, and so I said I would have to ask those who were organising the meeting, because I was simply a guest, whether it would be permitted. And they said they had no objection, and so the ABC arrived. They set their cameras in motion, but luckily we had an independent man videoing that particular programme. And so I watched with interest to see what would come out when it finally appeared on the ABC. And it came out in this way. Mr. Jeremy Lee deceived the people of Gilganra by refusing to reveal that he was a member of the League of Rights until they had already arrived in the hall. It just happens that the Gilganra paper carried a full-page advertisement 1 week before advertising me as a League of Rights speaker. So when I approached Countrywide to ask whether they would correct that particular lie which was put over, I've never had a reply to it yet. In fact, there are good grounds for legal action, and I've had advice to that effect from a top QC. That's the sort of nonsense that Senator Boswell is repeating. The League of Rights is not fussy about who it targets. Its directors are sophisticated strategists. They promote League ideology to small business groups, church women's organizations, and many other disaffected groups. The emphasis is not on attracting League members per se, but on getting these groups to use League thinking, arguments, and literature in order to reach such a variety of interest groups and to keep their more subversive policies hidden in the background. Well, you see, it sounds terrible, but obviously, if I'm going to go out to speak to any group, church or any other group, I'm going to try and persuade them to agree with what I say. I can't see there's anything subversive about that at all. I'm quite prepared to accept that what I say must be considered on its merits. I'm quite prepared to have people disagree with me, but I cannot see what is wrong in using your freedom to advocate what you believe and hoping that others will agree with you. Senator Boswell seems to think that that is totally inappropriate. He then goes on to table in Parliament a list of the League front, what he calls front groups. And listed amongst those are Institute of Economic Democracy and a body called Ladies in Line Against Communism. And I'll just show you how far-fetched this is. A front group, according to the dictionary definition, is a group or a movement that hides its origins in order to deceive people. The Institute of Economic Democracy I've been the secretary of ever since it started, and that's 13 years now. Every single issue of the journal that I produce carries the fact that it is an organ or a division of the League of Rights. How can that be a front movement? Ladies in Line Against Communism is a small movement that was started here in Queensland in 1967, and I think disbanded or discontinued in 1968. But Senator Boswell has got it listed as one of the divisions of the League. Why? Because he's relying for his source material on totally unethical material produced by Mr. K.D. Gott and other left-wingers. Effectively, the minds of Jeremy Lee and Eric Butler feed and control and hence distort the voices of many. The voices of these supporters are themselves trained to be more vocal than the other members of the community, and this is certainly not democracy. Gracious me. While openly admiring the administrative facilities of the churches, Jeremy Lee sanctimoniously suggests that the churches need to create a new ministry to inform and educate their members on the terrible conspiracies which threaten their very existence and to learn how to work against them. I've got to be honest in saying I plead guilty to that. My emphasis in all the meetings that I've addressed in Christian churches, and perhaps I could say that over the last year or two I have received addresses from literally requests and invitations from literally scores of different churches. I've spoken to full gospel groups. I've spoken to many churches of the Assemblies of God. I've spoken to Anglican churches, full gospel churches. I have never spoken to a church without a formal written invitation that I do so. I've always tried to stress that I believe the church is the key instrument, and when I say church, I not mean one denomination, but the body of Christian believers in the period ahead. But they must widen their understanding of the Christian gospel to perceive that Christianity touches every area of life, not just the matter of personal salvation, but also the social order, how we relate to each other, how human being lives in a world created by God, and only by obeying his laws is that possible. But for some reason, Senator Boswell believes that that is sanctimonious. I have suggested that churches should now broaden their scope into a new ministry and begin to try and accept responsibility for what is happening to our nation. I cannot see how that is subversive. He goes on and then deals with the World Heritage. I have vigorously opposed World Heritage listing on the grounds of its intrusion into state rights, the loss of jobs, the effect on family life, and the general negative economic impact on small towns in the area. I visited the area on 8 or 9 occasions. The League of Rights offers the bewildered timber workers a fascinating theory on why their jobs are being sacrificed. These decent, honest men and their families are told of a plan by Jewish bankers to take over their forests and lands to add to their own equity base under an international treaty. International treaties and organizations are generally equated by the League with one world government conspiracy. Now, he is referring here to the recent tour that I had up in North Queensland. And I want to say emphatically that that is a most destructive and untrue attack for this reason, that at no address, in no interview, on no media coverage, did I mention the word Jewish bankers. It is a word that has simply been introduced into this by Senator Boswell himself. Why? Because he is desperate to try and pin the label of anti-Semitism where it doesn't exist. That's the truth of it. What I did say was this, that at the recent Fourth World Wilderness Congress, held in Colorado in the United States, a proposition was put to that Congress by two bankers. One was Mr. David Rockefeller, who incidentally I believe is a Baptist, as if it mattered, and the other one was Mr. Edmund de Rothschild, that they would be prepared to form a world conservation bank and take world wilderness areas as collateral. Now, that's not a figment in the imagination of Jeremy Lee. That appeared, first of all, in the Chicago Tribune and was posted to me by a contact that I have in the United States. But before printing that, I then started checking to see whether it was true. And so I contacted an old friend of mine in North Queensland who just happened to be the president of the Second World Wilderness Congress that was held in Cairns in 1980, Mr. Wally O'Grady, who has since left that movement because he believes it is being used as a political vehicle. But he was the world chairman for that Congress, a great friend of mine, a man I know well and intimately, who is very concerned that the whole conservation movement is being politicized. And so he sent me the official documents of the Fourth World Wilderness Congress, all of which confirmed what I was saying. The result of that was I published the newsletter which I produced, setting out those allegations, not claiming that this was part of our government, pointing out that the committee behind the World Heritage Treaties was a UNESCO committee from which both Britain and America have withdrawn because of its communist leanings, setting out the fact of the article which had appeared in the Chicago Tribune, and then listing on the back of my newsletter some questions which I believe should be directed to federal and state members of Parliament. And in the process of doing that, I wrote to one of my own senators, Senator Flo Jelke-Peterson, on December the 10th, and I asked her whether she would list those questions in Parliament. This was her reply, December the 10th, 1987. Dear Jeremy, thank you for your letter of the 28th of November and the publication entitled Enterprise. With regard to the questions you require answered, I feel only certain ones relate to the federal government, and accordingly I have put these questions on notice to the Minister for the Environment and the Arts. Rest assured, when I have Senator Richardson's response, I will of course write to you again. Thank you so much for your support. I will pass your message on, and I'm sure Sir Joe will be encouraged by your remarks. I've made some remarks about Sir Joe. About 2 days ago, I got this letter back. Just a brief note, Jeremy, this attached reply which I have received from Senator Richardson is forwarded for your information. This is nearly 6 months after the original request was made. She asked the 3 questions, and Senator Richardson's answer to the first question was as follows. The simple answer to this part of the question, in other words, whether approaches had been made to the Commonwealth Government, is no. While the answer is simple, the origin of the question raises serious concerns. I find it somewhat alarming that the Honourable Senator's questions are almost word for word those quoted in the October 1987 issue of Enterprise, the organ of the Institute of Economic Democracy, which is a specialist division of the Australian League of Rights. It also concerns me greatly that a body such as the League of Rights, for reasons totally unrelated to conservation issues, is working itself into this debate and disseminating propaganda in Queensland and other Australian states. Now just think about that for a moment. I have some evidence which is confirmed from the Fourth World Wilderness Congress which raises enormous implications for Australia and the government. I print these in my newsletter not as an allegation but as questions which I believe should be asked of members of Parliament. I write to one of my own senators representing Queensland to ask her whether she could get the information, and as is her duty, she tables those questions in order to get an answer, and is then attacked by the minister for framing the question in the words that I used. What on earth is she supposed to do? Isn't it her duty to relay questions which are raised by members of the electorate? Does it matter that the question was phrased the same as whether it was the League of Rights? Are the League of Rights members not supposed to be represented in Parliament? You see, the whole thing is a scam, and my own opinion is that what Senator Richardson had raised was simply intimidation, trying to prevent Liberals and Nationals from asking legitimate questions concerned with world heritage, none of which seems to have deterred Senator Boswell at all. The people are listening to a voice that is a lone cry in the wilderness. This is Boswell continuing. The League's original policies and theories were based on social or Douglas credit economic policy, which has been soundly thrashed by recognised governments and by recognised economists. This has been done worldwide. Simply put, it states that if only a government would print more money and lend it at token rates of interest, then all problems would be solved and everybody could live in a virtual utopia. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't mind if people criticise social credit. I believe in social credit. I believe firmly in it. I don't really take into much account what is termed discrediting by recognised economists. Every economist that we know is arguing vitally now about economic policies. It's quite obvious the economic policies that we're getting are wrong. But I do believe that if you're going to discuss social credit, you should at least try and interpret it correctly. I've had a long debate with Sir Robert Sparks about the issue of money creation. It actually transpired in 1971 that he put 2 full-page articles in the Queensland Country Life on this question, which was replied to by myself with a full-page article. And in that article I made it absolutely clear that I disagreed with the amount of money that was being created in Australia. That in actual fact we should be creating much less money than we are now, but we should be doing it a different way. Now, this is a technical subject and I'm not going to get into it, but the line that social credit simply wants to print unlimited money and dish it out is so nonsensical that only really people who've never looked into it would even be tricked by it. It's one that they try and perpetuate at all times in order to discredit the idea. I believe the time is coming when these things can be discussed rationally. Jeremy Lee publicly defends Butler. Yes, I do. And as late as October 1987, Lee chaired the annual League dinner in Melbourne. That is true. The League's dim view of World War II events should not come as a surprise if one turns back to a Commonwealth Parliamentary Board of Inquiry in 1946. Now, I hope you'll listen to this carefully. This is monstrous. Mr. Justice Reed, who headed the inquiry, compared, and this is supposed to be an investigation into Mr. Butler, compared Butler's writings with those of the British traitor John Amory, Jr., and with Nazi propaganda. The inquiry rose as a result of Butler's supporters protesting loudly about the measures being taken to further the Australian war effort. In its examination of Butler's writings, the Reed report concluded as follows. Certain similarities will be observed with Nazi propaganda. Anti-Semitism and the alleged activities of the international financiers have been prominent points of Nazi propaganda. Some of the propaganda used by the enemy coincides with many of the arguments used by those interested in social credit and monetary reforms, and attacks our institutions of government on wartime measures and on the present monetary system of the nature to which we have referred may be exactly what the Nazis would desire. And Senator Boswell goes on, I doubt that many service clubs and associations which have invited Butler and Lee to speak to them in the past are aware of this commission of inquiry or its findings. Well, that's all very well, except that those were not the findings of that inquiry. And I would just like to therefore read you briefly what the true findings were, because Mr. Butler was mentioned by name. The first point is the inquiry was not into Mr. Butler at all. It was into a gentleman called Mr. Angus Dean. Second point is it was not held in 1946, as Senator Boswell suggests. It was in 1945. And the findings of the Reed inquiry exactly are as follows. Practically, Section 61, practically all those who are interested in these matters are very active in spreading their views, and engage in what without offence may be called propaganda. Most of them devote a great deal of their time to studying the questions in issue and are intensely interested in political, social and economic matters, an attitude which we venture to suggest may very well be emulated by a great many more of the citizens of the Commonwealth. We say at once that apart from some slight suspicion regarding one or two individuals, those who have come under our notice are loyal to His Majesty the King and are actuated by a sincere desire to improve the lot of themselves and their fellow men and to bring about a better state of society. Quite a number of the witnesses served their country in the last war. Quite a number have sons or relatives fighting in this war, and in some cases the sons have lost their lives. We may give one or two examples. Mr. Dean served in the Navy during the last war. Mr. Partington has lost 3 sons in this war. Mr. Madden has 3 sons in the second AIF. Mr. Byers has served in the Merchant Navy during the present war. Mr. Bruce Brown had lost a son in this war. Mr. Eric Butler is a member of the second IF. Mr. Brock is a returned soldier from the last war and is doing military duty to the present time. Loyal to His Majesty the Queen, actuated by a sincere desire to improve the lot of themselves and their fellow men and to bring about a better state of society. How does that equate with the findings that Senator Boswell has misquoted? And the reason he's misquoted them is they came from the left-wing Fabians and he hasn't bothered to check them, hasn't even got the date right, and he's using them now to discredit fellow Christians without any attempt to try and verify the source of it. I think it is quite monstrous. And I'd like to have it on record that this is the sort of treatment Eric Butler has been subjected to right through, and I think it's time it was answered. Mr. Acting President, these allegations and predictions have been thoroughly investigated and proved wrong by the events of time. He then goes on to deal with Peter Sawyer. Even the most ardent supporter of Mr. Sawyer is doubting his credibility, but never forget that the Deputy Director of the League of Rights, Mr. Jeremy Lee, was on the same platform as Peter Sawyer, and in fact arranged for Peter Sawyer to speak at a series of meetings which were recorded and the tapes were sent right round Australia. I'd just like perhaps to go on record about my opinion on Peter Sawyer. I believe that Peter Sawyer has made some errors in some of the predictions that he's made. I believe that Peter Sawyer is a young man without any experience, but nevertheless, much of what he says bears thinking about and does need investigation. I was concerned and interested in what he said because I was worried about surveillance in this country, particularly following the ID card argument. And I believe that there is much more to verify what Peter Sawyer says than Senator Boswell gives him credit for in view of the light of 3 things. The first was a report submitted to the federal government by Aztec called Towards a Cashless Society, just before the ID card argument, which pointed out that technology had reached such a stage that linked to an Australia card, we could have a system of surveillance which could control the lives of all citizens. That was never reported. The second thing is, we now know that the ID card is coming back in a different form through the tax file number. And the third point is, we know that that is being linked internationally now through the OECD into an international tax file number. All those matters Peter Sawyer has dealt with. He may not have got it completely right, but I believe he's a courageous fellow. I believe that he has been much maligned. I believe that his inexperience has led him to make predictions which have been rash, and I wouldn't go along with those. But to take the attitude which Senator Boswell has taken is quite ridiculous. I think Peter Sawyer has done more good than harm. That's my own honest opinion. Mr. Acting Deputy President, I make this speech in the Senate today at some political risk. I think that's absolute nonsense. But I make it nevertheless because decent men and women are responding to the League of Rights without knowing its true face. It is wrong for Australia. It is against every tradition which this nation is built on. The Australian League of Rights is subversive, operating through front organisations and massive propaganda campaigns. It is destabilising and manipulative. Although its members call themselves the educators of the masses, they are really the manipulators of the fears and ignorance of the masses. All of those things I totally and utterly reject. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude by raising one or two matters that I think are important. The whole issue, basically, which is causing such a furore is the issue or the accusation of anti-Semitism. And therefore I'd like to go on record to try and place my own position with regard to the very vexed and difficult question of anti-Semitism and the Jewish people. The first thing that I want to say is this. I absolutely repudiate any suggestion that I am anti-Semitic or that I wish anything for Jewish people in the form of any harm whatsoever. I believe their rights must be protected, their interests protected by law, just the same as any other particular race. I would like to then go on record as saying that as far as the state of Israel is concerned, I support its existence in contravention of the accusations that are often made. But I also want to say that that leads to a number of things that need definition. The first of which is, what size and where does it stop? You see, the great argument in the Middle East today is not just a question of the Jews versus the Arabs, but it's the extent of where it's going to be. How big should the Israel be? Do we take one line, that the whole of what used to be scriptural Israel should now be handed back to the state of Israel, which would double or triple its existing size? Or do we go back to the boundaries which were established when that state was first created? Those are big issues. I totally repudiate the idea that they can keep extending their boundaries and start occupying areas, creating more and more refugees in the process. I believe that the whole tremendous battle now between the Jews and the Arabs in Gaza and in the West Bank is against all the rational advice of nations right around the world, who stated long ago their opposition to the occupation by Israel of the West Bank and the subsequent harm that it was going to do to their particular cause and to the interests of the Arab people. That's the first issue. The second issue that I want to make it absolutely clear is that I think we have now got to make a distinct difference between the Jewish people and a movement called Zionism. And by doing that, I think it is time we paid recognition to a most courageous and unheeded group of Jewish people, which is the growing number of Jewish people who totally reject Zionism and are now, in an effort to get their voices heard, holding bigger and bigger demonstrations for peace in Israel at the present time. To repudiate what they stand for is, I would say, just as anti-Semitic as some of the other allegations that are made. The third thing is, I believe it is quite ridiculous to simply try and maintain the idea that any criticism at all of Israel is anti-Semitic. We've had a spate of newspaper reports about what is happening in the Middle East just in recent days. I'd just like to mention one or two because I think they're important. This particular article came out in The Australian, the 18th of March, 1988, written by James Murray, who writes their religious column, and who incidentally has often taken the League of Rights to task. But this is what he says: I have little personal respect for the obduracy and indignation of Mr. Shamir, the present Prime Minister of Israel, whose leadership of the Stern gang in the days of the Israeli struggle for independence reveals serious flaws. His participation in the entire destruction of an Arab village, Deir Yassin, and of his predecessor Menachem Begin in 1948 hardly stands to either's credit. Indeed, many Jews still tremble at the thought of it when men, women and children were massacred. I believe that is true. This article came out in the Weekend Australian, March the 19th and 20th, 1988, 2 jailed for burial of the living. You might remember the report which appeared on television that some of the Israeli soldiers had laid Arab civilians on the ground and had then tried to bury them alive with bulldozers. And it was only when they had gone they were able to dig them out and resuscitate them. It was just a miracle they were still alive. They were taken to court and they were given 2 months' jail. 2 months. I would say that equates with many of the atrocities which we're still raking over of what occurred during the war. This article came out in the Australian, January the 20th, 1988. Israelis destroy food for refugees. I would have thought that is brutal and needs some sort of criticism. This came out on the 22nd of February, 1988. Army study confirms Israeli brutality. Israeli troops shot dead 2 Palestinians, one a 12-year-old boy, and wounded several others during protests in the occupied West Bank yesterday, military sources said. The latest deaths came as Israeli army chiefs, already shocked by the beating and the partial burial of 4 Palestinian youths, were digesting a secret internal report which confirms that their soldiers have been using brutal methods in the occupation territories. Is that anti-Semitism? I think it's a reasonable report of brutality. This report came out in the Australian on March the 3rd. Brutality, and army stands ill at ease. It makes shocking reading. The heads of the Israeli Army Central Command, General Amram Mitzner, was treated to a sneak preview of a CBS News clip just before it was flashed across television screens round the world. The clip shows 2 Palestinian prisoners sitting on the ground, arms and legs bound, being brutally kicked and beaten beaten with rocks by 4 Israeli soldiers. It was a scene that left the hardened Israel general literally speechless and reduced one military source to concede that it might be stretching credibility to claim that this was just another aberration. He was right. Soon calls were pouring into the foreign ministers in Jerusalem from embattled Israeli embassies round the world, seeking clarification and guidance on how to explain the episode. Clearly, the official explanation that this incident, like previous cases of brutality, had been a deviation was no longer adequate. The British Foreign Office expressed shock and horror at the incident. The Dutch Prime Minister, Mr. Lubbers, hinted that he might cancel a visit planned to coincide with Israel's 40th anniversary. In May, Swiss Army officers who had been invited to spend a week in Israel cancelled their trip at the suggestion of their government, and a Belgian Defence Ministry purchasing mission also put off its trip. Perhaps they could have added that the European Parliament has now officially withdrawn its food preferences, trade preferences with Israel in the face of the enormous brutality being perpetrated. But that doesn't alter the fact that quite recently in Canada, their Foreign Minister, Mr. Joe Clark, who expressed concern at the brutality being perpetrated in the Middle East at the present time, was viciously attacked by the Anti-Defamation League of one of the Jewish committees, and a public apology was demanded of him simply because they accused him of being anti-Semitic. I want to say that the days when any criticism of Israel can be written off as anti-Semitic have long since gone. Long since gone. The issue has got to come out, and even Israeli troops are now splitting right down the middle at the horrific brutality that is quite evident right through with regard to what is happening in the Middle East. I want to go a little further by dealing with some of the other issues which Senator Boswell has raised. The first of those is the claim that the Jews are the chosen people. I support Israel's right to exist, but I want to say that I do not believe the Israeli people living there at the present time have any connection with the chosen people of Scripture whatsoever. I think there is overwhelming evidence that this is not true, from Jewish sources, from historical sources, from many Jewish authorities at the present time who repudiate what Christian leaders in some cases insist is true in the face of all the evidence. And that means that they've got to be treated fairly as any other nation, but they can no longer resort to some of the claims that are being made. I believe that the perpetuation of this idea that what is happening in Israel is ordained of God, and therefore any criticism of Israel, whether it is right or wrong, must be seen as something that is offensive to Christians, has got to be challenged, because it is leading the Christian church into deep error. It has led, for example, the situation where over in America the Reverend Jerry Falwell quite recently made an appeal that America should return to being a Christian nation, was immediately attacked by a number of Jewish rabbis and abjectly apologized because he didn't want to offend them. I think that's monstrous. It has led to a number of things happening. May I just give you, for example, 2 examples. This article came out in the Los Angeles Times in 1979, and it shows to what lengths Christians have compromised their faith in this pursuit. This is what it said: Christians and Jews working on joint worship details. Interfaith inclined Christians and Jewish leaders who have explored most aspects of mutual understanding and relative harmony are trying to resolve a particularly sticky question: how to conduct inoffensive but enriching joint worship services. Christians and Jews, both people of the book, acknowledge and worship the same God, having thus a unique relationship. I don't believe that that can be said to be true at the present time. It then goes on to say this: one of the most dramatic incidents in their dialogue was a recent day-long symposium sponsored by the National Council of Churches and the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. The problems inherent in joint worship have not yet been solved, he said. But those attending the session expressed the hope that some of those problems could be overcome without reducing combined worship to its lowest common denominator. Our parishioners are seeking more than a mere exercise in human relationship. A model service prepared for the symposium, including recitation of the Ten Commandments and the Apostles' Creed, prayers for each tradition, including the Jewish prayer for the Torah and the Christian Lord's Prayer, as well as readings from the Psalms and the New Testament account of the Pentecost. But symposium participants later agreed in guidelines being finalized jointly for distribution by Reform Judaism and NCC affiliates that prayers should be addressed to God alone and should not be in the name of Jesus or the Trinity. Using the Lord's Prayer was not advised, not because of the text itself, but because of its strong historical identification with the Church alone. I've got to be honest that those who take their Christian faith seriously know perfectly well that it is quite scriptural to say that Jesus Christ is the only Saviour and mediator. There can be no approach other than through him. And that to start cooperating in prayers which specifically and deliberately exclude his name, quite honestly, is blasphemy. But then you can go further than this. This article appeared in the Australian Jewish News just 2 years ago. I would ask you, as Christians, what you think the response of Christians should be. This is quoting Rabbi Zajcik, the spiritual head of Mizrachi organization, speaking at a 1986 appeal drawing room meeting in Melbourne quite recently. Jesus felt that in order to recreate the Jewish establishment to its preeminence of days gone by, it was necessary to get rid of that establishment and to replace it with his own henchmen. Rabbi Zajcik said Jesus' rebellious nature could be attributed to his failure to fill a vacancy within the Sanhedrin. He was rejected because of his lack of knowledge rather than his rebellious nature, Rabbi Zajcik said. Jesus was born to Jewish parents. It was not an immaculate conception. He was born as you and I. Rabbi Zajcik dismissed the resurrection of Jesus as the biggest lie ever created in the annals of history. In Christian theology, the Jew is something less than a human being. That is not true. Whether hatred rose due to preconceived ideas that Jews have chosen themselves from amongst the nations of the world, or because Jews were seen as hard-necked people, whichever way, there is an historical and theological beginning. Let us not forget that everything is based upon the New Testament. Rabbi Zajcik said that in all 102 places that Jews are mentioned in the New Testament, they are mentioned in a derogatory form and mentioned as something less than a human being which the devil has created. In other words, they want to repudiate the New Testament as anti-Semitic. Do we accept that as Christians? I believe it is possible for Christians, in fact it is the duty of Christians, to uphold their faith while holding out the hand of friendship to Jews. But I don't believe it is possible with that sort of attitude. And therefore I want to state quite categorically that I repudiate any claim of anti-Semitism, but I insist that it is my duty to stand for my Christian faith and my God. And my God is the Trinity, including our Lord Jesus Christ, who is my personal Saviour. If that is regarded by Senator Boswell as anti-Semitic, well, so be it, but that's where I stand. I would like to finish by two messages. The first message is the message to the National Party. The National Party is a once great party. Its traditions are tremendous. It once stood for God, Queen and country, but I believe it has sacrificed an enormous number of those. And if it is to retrieve its original stand, it has got to start dealing with some of the issues which so far it has been frightened to deal with. And I would like to just perhaps, I've lost my paper. I'd just like to deal with one or two of the things that have got to be dealt with by the National Party. The first thing is, I think it has now got to face the fact that there is a strong revolt throughout Australia against the party system as it is run today. I do not believe it is possible to equate party politics automatically with democracy. I think it is important to remember that we went through 400 years of British parliamentary history without having any political parties at all. I think it is important to point out that traditionally there is room for parties as groupings of people with a similar philosophical idea. But once it has reached a strait of discipline where under party whips no member can be nominated for Parliament unless he is prepared to hand his conscience over to his party, that is, I believe, a criminal intrusion into democracy which is destroying elected government at the present time. We need parties to get back to the idea of allowing their men and their members to operate on conscience and to represent their electorate directly. And I believe that is what the Australian people now want. It's an accusation or it's a criticism which also applies to the Liberal Party, which also applies to the Labour Party. Party politics now, under the rigidity it has reached, is destroying the conscience of its members of Parliament and thus their effective representation. I believe that the voters' veto, far from being a tool for the League of Rights, is a tool which would give all the Australian people the chance to have a say. And I think that Mr Ahern is right if he is going to lead his party in that direction. He is following the lead of the Liberals, and I hope that the Labour Party itself will remember that it was once part of their own platform. The sort of accusation levelled by Senator Boswell is nonsense. I believe that the National Party has now got to deal with some of the issues facing Australia. It's got to start really defending the Constitution. It's got to start exposing the use of international treaties to destroy our right from having a say for the monstrosity that it really is. I think it's got to start looking at some of the real issues instead of attacking those who dare to talk about what they don't dare talk about. And last but not least, it was only recently we had in this city of Toowoomba an address by an eminent lawyer, Mr David Mitchell, who pointed out that the Australia Act had effectively turned Australian states into de facto republics. The evidence is that that is right. It has destroyed the reserve powers of the Queen and the states. I would ask the National Party, how did they vote in that matter? How can they claim to be loyal to the Queen if they didn't even bother to find out what it was about? Are they prepared to fight to retrieve the situation which has been lost through that act? And if they're not prepared to stand up and be counted on that issue, don't attack those who are prepared to stand up. I believe the National Party can once again represent country people, but it's got to start fighting for the issues instead of simply attacking those who are trying to do a better job than they are. And I'd also like to send a final message to my brothers and sisters in the Christian Church. I believe the Christian Church basically is the key instrument in the future. I don't believe in it's a particular denomination, but what could be called a mystical body of people who believe and have accepted our Lord Jesus Christ. They are now making the running right throughout the world. They're making the running even in the Soviet Union, in Afghanistan, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in a tremendous Christian growth now starting in the Western world. I believe the Christian Church, if it is obedient and gets back to truth, is the body which can turn this nation. It's got to be humble, but it's got to be resolute. It's got to stop simply listening to slander. It's got to stop allowing one Christian to attack another Christian without justification. It's got to bring these issues right out into the open. It's got to repudiate the idea of fatalism which has crept into so many Christian churches. The idea that there is nothing we can do and that we're simply a defeated minority at the end of time. I don't believe that is true. I believe that the church has an exciting future if it obeys its leader, and that is the Lord Jesus Christ. It can become the decisive force in this nation. That is my concern. And whether you agree with me or not, I believe we've got to reach a state of maturity where the sort of nonsense that has been produced in Senator Boswell's speech, whether wittingly or unwittingly, is seen as the nonsense, the shallow nonsense it really is brought into the open, is dealt with, and then those wounds can be forgotten, and our nation once again becomes something that we're proud of as we end our bicentenary year in 1988. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to just conclude by mentioning one or two books that I think are tremendously important. The first one is at the time that Philip Adams and Mr. Gott and the left wing of the Labour Party in Victoria attacked the League, Eric Butler wrote a book called The Truth About the League of Rights, which documents the whole history of how the thing was born, and much of the evidence, some of it is astounding evidence. The bank nationalisation case, some of the issues involved with that Reed inquiry, and a lot of it actually shows what enormous support he was getting from Labour parties during the war, which is very embarrassing to them now because it's a different Labour Party. I've only got one copy, but we can get copies for anybody who'd really like to read The Truth About the League of Rights. That's a very important book because it presents an answer in documented form to what I've been saying tonight. I believe a book that every Christian should read, because I think it is throws some incredible light on the situation, is a book called Prophecy in Politics. It's a very humane and gentle book written by a journalist in the United States on the question of what is happening in Israel at the present time. She went on one of those conducted Christian tours with Jerry Falwell, and she reports in this book on what happened and the tremendous dead end that that particular branch of the church is being led into by its misinterpretation of prophecy. And it must make all Christians think. I think it is absolutely compelling reading. It's had good reviews in many papers, and I do recommend that book, certainly not anti-Semitic, by Grace Halsell, Prophecy in Politics. I've got stocks here tonight. That's $12 a copy. A couple of other books that you might find fascinating. There's a tremendous book called Who Are the Jews? That sounds a provocative title, but this is the evidence of a major court case that was recently held in New Zealand on this issue under a prosecution from the Human Rights Commission. And because it involved the question of Jews, the court had to decide whether the Jewish people were a race or a faith, or whether they were the chosen people, or where they came from, or whether they were an ethnic group. And the evidence presented was absolutely staggering on this question. So for those who have blindly accepted what I believe is largely a myth, and that is that the residents of modern Israel are direct descendant from the chosen people of the Old Testament, this is an amazing book. It's worth reading. The evidence before a court over in New Zealand and all that went on there. A book produced by a pastor in America called Israel, Our Duty, Our Dilemma, Pastor Theodore Winston Pike. I don't agree with all his writings on prophecy, but he's produced a very deep look at the whole question of the creation of the state of Israel, what is involved, and what this means for the Christian believer. It can't by any stretch of imagination be construed as anti-Semitic, but it does present a different point of view that Christians should consider. Israel, Our Duty, Our Dilemma, I believe it's a little bit more than most people want to pay, $18, but it's imported. I've got a limited number of those tonight. A couple more books that I'd like to mention. Senator Boswell has made a great play of the fact that both Mr. Butler and myself are attacking democracy. A few years ago I wrote a little book called Conscience Voting, which presented the evidence from many statesmen and parliamentarians around the world on how our democracy is breaking down, and this was an answer that I tried to suggest on how we've got to remedy it. It's fairly cheap, that's only $2. It's a humble effort, but I think it does give the lie to this idea that we're attacking democracy. There's often quotes made about Eric Butler and his views on the Jewish question, but no mention is ever made to a little book that he's written on this called Censored History. Written a few years ago. It presents, I think, a very logical and rational view on the whole question of the state of Israel and some of the subsequent political events. That's only $1.50. Why is it that none of his critics ever mention this little book where he presents his views? Last but not least, I'd like to mention this book, The Unholy Alliance, written by a former Canadian member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who became an agent inside the Communist Party, intelligence. Presents some astounding evidence on how the whole issue of anti-Semitism is built up and used by the Communist Party to try and isolate any conservative. And he quotes from John Barron how they were actually having communist groups in East Germany coming over into West Germany and painting swastikas on the synagogues to try and defame West Germans, and the effect that it had. It was a disinformation campaign. There's some staggering evidence in that little book for those that want to look a little bit further. The Zionist Connection, tremendous volume, written by a Jewish author who happens to be a non-Zionist and has himself been attacked for being anti-Semitic. Quite ridiculous, considering he's Jewish. It's a very well-documented book on the whole history of the Middle East, the Zionist Connection too. I haven't got copies with me, but we can take orders for that. And those are all books that I recommend. I have a large stock of some of those books here, some other ones we've got to order. I'd like to conclude this meeting by thank you for coming along, and I hope that you'll help to try and get an answer to Senator Boswell round, because I tell you, we're on the edge of one of the greatest, most political disinformation campaigns we've probably ever seen in the history, certainly since the last World War, to try and silence and neutralize both conservatives and Christians in an atmosphere of fear, and only ordinary people can dispel that. But thank you for coming. I hope it's been of interest.